Hello and welcome. I'm Chris Braitch, and this is the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I am an emotional health and leadership coach and co-founder of the not-for-profit Seen and Heard, which supports those seeking healing, connection, and systemic change. My vision is to move myself and the world around me towards connection and compassion. And each week, I will connect with amazing guests who are on their journey to bring about meaningful change in their own lives and the world around them. Thanks for being here. Let's get started. Welcome everybody to the Seen and Heard podcast, a conversational series. I have the great delight today to be joined by David Walker. David is the Executive Director, Boarding and Director of the BSA, the Boarding School Association, and TOB, which is the Institute of Boarding, and joined the BSA group in August 2023. He has over 20 years experience in boarding schools and has worked in a range of schools in the UK and Africa, alongside being a prep school governor and a trustee. Before taking up his post at the BSA, David was Deputy Head Pastoral at a large co-ed independent school in the Southeast. Welcome, David.
Hello, Chris. Lovely to be here.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's amazing for you to be here. I really appreciate you taking the time. And, we've been chatting for about a year and a half. You've always been very gracious with your time. We've spoken about all sorts of things for current pupils, ex-pupils, around wellbeing and welfare. So I really appreciate you engaging for the last year and a bit.
Well, it's been good to get to know you, Chris, and thank you for the invitation to this. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, same. So we've got you gave us a really lovely opportunity as well coming up, which is a chance to speak to your member schools about the importance of wellbeing and welfare for alumni. So for ex-pupils as well. So want to recognise that having an opportunity to speak to schools about that is appreciated. So thanks for making that happen.
Yeah, look forward to that as well. In due course.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah, good. Well, let's get into it. Always in the podcast, I begin at the beginning. So I'd love to hear a little bit about your journey. So particularly, early years, what was life like for you? Because we're all shaped by those formative years. So I'd love to hear a bit about your journey.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And I always struggle with questions like this because I think there's, what's there to say? I mean, I grew up in a small Berkshire town. I think I probably, once I became a teenager, wanted to get away from it as quickly as possible, really. But looking back on it, actually, really, really blessed with a lovely childhood. And actually, boarding was the furthest from my mind. It just didn't cross into my existence at all. I went to what I lovingly describe, and I say lovingly because I'm still involved with them as he said, as vice chair of trustees at what is now the Multi Academy Trust, the MAT that my school was. But I went to a bog standard comp, and never really. I mean, I was actually not far from a fairly big boarding school that I ended up working in, but didn't really cross my mind at all. I probably would have struggled to put it on a map. So went through. As it turns out, I only discovered this very recently that my granddad did teach at a boarding school, at a state boarding school. So my granddad taught for a couple of years at Old Swinford Hospital, which is near Birmingham, I guess. But I never knew that at the time, and would never had that conversation. So yeah, very very sort of very standard childhood, but happy and loved, and very grateful for that.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks for sharing that, David. Yeah, it must have been quite strange to find out. Yeah, you've got that family connection to boarding somewhere back there in the history. But what were you like as a young person? Were you kind of very active? Were you academic? What did you love to do?
I mean, typical boy, really. Sport was was very much central to my world, and specifically football. Absolutely loved football. I'm a Crystal Palace fan, so lots of people then turn around and say, "Well, I thought you said you loved football." But at the time, and that probably says actually, the fact that lots of my friends would have supported Liverpool and Everton and Man United. I chose to go with the family team. My family on my mum's side come from South London, so I enjoyed doing that. Lots of sport across the piece. So played a lot of cricket, rugby. Academically, didn't really have a huge focus on it, but was okay, and found myself in decent sets, and ended up taking myself more seriously academically as time went on. Having had a sort of seminal moment with my teacher or my tutor at the time in the lower sixth. I remember him sitting me down, and I mean, perhaps it's an exaggeration to say he tore strips of me, but I was certainly given a fairly stern talking to say, pull yourself together because you're not working hard enough and you're not taking advantage of your opportunities, and that was a real changing point. I remember that, and actually looking back, my mum found my old lower sixth report, which was not brilliant by any stretch. And then I went on to have a much better upper sixth, and did well in the A levels, and took on a sort of school leadership post and that sort of thing. So I think I was probably a fairly typical boy in that sport and hanging out and spending time with friends was more important in the early years, and then suddenly pulled it out at the last minute.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, thanks for hearing that. So it's funny, isn't it, that you obviously went on to a long teaching career, but that moment with a teacher, we could probably all remember, a few really difficult ones. We can always remember a few inspirational ones, but teachers really do, have a huge impact on young people, don't they? And it's the importance of getting. You're not going to get it right all the time, but getting most of those interactions with young people right as a teacher, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And there was another very inspirational teacher I had, my maths teacher, who never really had those sorts of moments, but I just really sort of respected him, enjoyed how he interacted with us, and it was lovely actually to be able to then come back years and years later, come back into, as it was then, governing at that school, and meet him again, and be able to actually say to him, "You're actually the reason I'm in education, is because I wanted to, have the impact that you had on so many people." So, yeah, there's definitely that. That's been influential.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, I mean, for me, there was there's one teacher that really saved me. I think it was my second prep school, so 10 to 13. PE teacher, rugby coach, squash coach, all that. Ex-army guy called Bill. But he was just lovely. Like, he lived on site with his wife and his son. They were just a nice family, and we're at boarding school, that sort of having someone who is really looking out for you, like, it makes a big difference. And often that's the role of the house parents, if you like, as well as the pastoral team and others. But he wasn't a housemaster. My housemaster, I had a few okay ones over the years. I had a few terrible ones. I had one good one, but he was just he stood out, I think, because he maybe I could go and talk to him about things when I was struggling. He would do little things, like he would give me the keys to the squash court when it was sort of technically not the time that I was supposed to be able to practice, and he'd go, just go and hit some balls, go and because when you're a young man as well, you got a lot of testosterone, you got a lot of anger bubbling around, you got all sorts of emotions going off. So I think he just recognised that in me. So I'm always thankful to Bill for that.
Yeah, it's nice to hear.
Yeah. Thank you. So, started to take things a bit more seriously, work-wise, started to move things. I mean, looking back on that interaction with that teacher, lower sixth, and having a long time in education, and you're a parent as well. Was it was it the was it what you needed? Was it delivered in the right way, or was it a massive kick up the arse and done in quite a harsh way? Looking back.
Well, it was both. It was done in a firm way. I mean, but I think I knew that the reason why he was doing it was because he had my best interests at heart, and the reason why he was able to do it in that way was because he knew me, and therefore, it was just a very stern talking to about how I was wasting my time and needed to have a think about what I was doing, and I think I probably slightly just sort of sleptwalked into that and just didn't realise that was the case, and so it was coming from a place of concern for me, and at the time, obviously, I probably walked out. I don't really remember walking out, but I probably walked out thinking, yeah, as you do, you try and dismiss it and try and minimise it, and then you think, actually, he's probably got a good point here. Yeah, and so I was grateful for that, but also grateful to be surrounded by lots of very good teachers at that particular school, all of whom cared and all of whom tried to support, and so it was good.
Oh, thanks for sharing a bit more about that. Really hearing that, although it was done in a pretty no frills way, because he knew you. That key of knowing you and having a relationship there, and because you sensed he had your best interests at heart, rather than whatever, just to hear the sound of his voice or the institution or whatever. He was like, there was some genuine care there that it struck a chord. So thanks. So, what came next for you then? So we know, because from the bio, that you end up in education, but how did you get there?
Yeah, I mean, partly that's also driven by another sort of formative influence, which is probably my parents. My mum was in teaching with younger ones, but it was actually my dad who was nothing to do with teaching. He was an engineer, and he, again, very, very loving, very caring, and obviously put a lot into the family. Quite a traditional way, mum did the nurturing and dad went out and worked very hard. But he didn't enjoy his job. Actually, was looking back on it, makes it even more sort of the fact that he still stuck it through for us all, even though he didn't enjoy going to work at all. I think is that in itself is testimony to the love and care that he showed, even though that wasn't sort of outward. But the fact that he went to work every day, and I saw him going to work every day, sort of, oh my goodness, I've got to go to work, was an influence in saying, actually, I want to do something where actually the end is the job itself rather than a means to an end. Interestingly, I actually ended up working for a summer with him, and he was totally different in work. He was actually quite bubbly and quite cheerful. But I think as an introvert, that probably was a lot of effort. So therefore, it tired him out to do that. So I came up with sort of at university thinking, right, well, what do I want to do? I want to do something where it matters. So it probably came down to being, in my mind, a policeman, but I was probably a bit scared. Being a doctor, and I was probably a bit squeamish, or a teacher. So I ended up when I was at university just doing a bit of volunteering in a local school, pretty tough school actually. It's closed now, in one of the tough areas of Bristol, and I remember walking around there, working with, helping out in different classrooms, and all the teachers would say to me, "Oh, don't go into teaching. That's a horrible profession." It was obviously morale was really low there, but didn't put me off. I signed up to do a PGC after my degree, and got put into a boarding school, and maybe one of the things was actually the contrast in terms of seeing the low morale in that school, and then going to the boarding school where actually it was the total opposite. Everyone seemed to love being there. People seem to be interested in your subject and enjoy lessons, and then suddenly realizing, wow, you can do other stuff as well. I can go and coach football or coach rugby, or and what's this boarding thing? How does that work? And just enjoying spending time with young people and trying to have that impact that I wanted to have seemed to be magnified in some way. That you had that possibility, and as a someone brand new into that sector, that was really, I mean, beyond sort of eye opening. It was a real revelation, and that's how I got into boarding. It was just sort of a 4-week placement on my teacher training, having never expected to be part of the sector at all.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. Yeah, we hear that. So, for you then, did once you finish your training, once you finish the PGC and the placement and stuff, because of that positive experience at that one boarding school, did you find yourself gravitating back to it?
Well, they offered me a job. So,
well, that's handy. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, so I did 4 weeks, enjoyed it, really got on there, and then I think it was a week or two into the next term. So this would be about January. They phoned me up and said, by the way, actually, we've got a job coming up, but please consider applying. And I did, and that was my first job. And I don't think it was a foregone conclusion in my mind, because I always assumed I'd go into state education, but I felt that was a really good opportunity in a school that I'd obviously really enjoyed. So tried out, and 25 years later or more, still involved in boarding. So there we are.
Yeah. How long were you at that first one that offered you the job?
I did 3 years there, and I followed that with I felt, having been at school and then been at university and then straight into teaching and again back into schools, as it were, I felt like I wanted to do something a bit different. So after 3 years, I applied for VSO, with Voluntary Services Overseas. I think it still exists as a charity. They placed professionals from mainly from the UK, although they've expanded that now, I think, in terms of they get people from all over the world, but going and volunteering to literally live and work in somewhere around the world. So I ended up working in Cameroon for 2 years after that, in a small village school. That's my only bit of my career that wasn't in a boarding school educationally. That was a little bit different, but so I did 3 years in my first school, and then a couple of years abroad.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, so great job for volunteering, going out there. Tell us, a little bit about that school, about the culture, the local people. What did you learn? What did you take away?
The one in Cameroon.
Yeah.
Do you mean? Yeah. Well, I was in so Cameroon's made of sort of 10 provinces, and 2 of them are Anglophone, and the rest are Francophone. So it was quite a sort of marginalised bit, and they certainly felt marginalised. It's up in the mountains near the Nigerian border, and the lovely thing now is I can get to sort of there's various people who post videos from the village on Facebook and things like that, so I get to sort of see what it's like even to today. But it was in some ways very, if you could sort of give the stereotype of, you've got 80 pupils in a room at their desks with a piece of chalk and a chalk, a blackboard, and that's it, that you've got to try and manage. So I used to love trying to make. I was a physics teacher, so trying to make experiments and equipment out of everyday objects. Whether it's making a gold leaf electroscope out of a water bottle and a bit of metal and a bit of tin foil, which you can do, and it's like so I used to love doing that. We got a British Council grant, and we managed to get some computers over and build a computer suite, because clearly that was what would help the local population, or those kids get jobs, because that's what the skills that they needed were just becoming to, that was when that was just coming into being required. So that was a really nice project to be able to sort of actually start in my second year. I basically, as a physics teacher, I started just teaching computing, and it was, compared to what you'd expect now with young people, it was literally like, here is this is called the monitor, this is called a keyboard, this is, to try and get right down to basics of how computers work. That was fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to know where to start. I could talk for hours on how different it was, but it was, yeah. And then, at the other end, I'd have an A-level class of just one, because there was only one person who wanted to do A-level maths that I was teaching there. So one-to-one teaching of A-level maths, because for people to actually make it all the way through their education, most people would do 2 or 3 years and then they'd stop because they had to go back and work on the farm. We didn't have running water for 2 years, because they built a big water tank and system for getting water to the village, and then someone ran off with the money, so they didn't finish it, and there was no more funds, so we had no running water for years. But wonderful experience to be just in that community. Really family orientated, really warm community. It felt really safe as well. Be happier walking around there at midnight on a Friday night than I would most places in the UK. It's really safe and wonderful environment.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate you giving us a little window into that. It's something my coach, Piers Cross, has done. He worked in Africa for many years. I've never done it, so I'm fascinated in hearing about that. So yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. And so coming back then to the journey. So I'm hearing a lot from your childhood. It was you grew up at home, grew up in the family community, went to the local school. You worked in this community in Africa and all together. So how, as you moved into boarding and you spent most of your career there, what occurred to you about this idea of young people effectively being raised or spending an awful lot of their time in schools, in institutions, rather than in the kind of community that you grew up in, sort of living at home, if you like? Because I know a lot of the teachers when I was at school, they'd all been through the system. They were military, or they were ex-boarders, or they were very used to it. Their families all were, etc. So for you, coming into it from not being your background mainly, what was your take on it?
Yeah, I think in the early stages, I didn't have much beyond thinking, here we all are, and the what those opportunities were really, and I suppose wanting to embrace as much of that myself, and seeing others, the young people in the school embracing that. And then I became attached to a boarding house, so I lived as an assistant housemaster with a really wonderful family who lived in the housemaster, with the housemaster himself and his family, who was a really really kind and really nurturing family that I was sort of, again, felt very grateful that they basically just included me along with all the boarders in their extended family that they were looking after in this house. And so I saw a really positive experience of a boarding house that was well run. There was lots of people who were seemed to be enjoying their time there. Lots of the other sort of tutors who came in and helped were similar in age, and so we had a good time. I also did see I remember a conversation with a boarder who was from Korea, also called David, and I saw him struggle with coming across. And it was actually quite an interesting conversation I had once with him. It was very late at night. I remember doing that sort of late night lock up and sort of checking the house was quiet, and he was still up and he was a bit upset. And I remember having a conversation with him and saying, what are you, tell me what's wrong, can I help, sort of thing. And he was talking about his life and how much time he was spending away from home. It was quite an interesting one though, because my initial response was feeling, that must be really sad. And so I started sort of trying to, say, let's talk about that. And he stopped me and he said, "Oh, no, actually, that's not what I'm upset about. What I'm upset about is that I've come here and I don't think I'm doing very well at this school." He was struggling with the language and things. And I'm worried that I'm letting my parents down. And that was quite an interesting, sort of, I totally assumed that he was upset that he'd been, sent away without any choice about that and without wanting to do this, and therefore he was upset there. He was actually upset because he thought, my parents are making so many sacrifices that and I'm letting them down. And I basically said, "You're not letting them down. Don't for a second think you're letting them down." And but it taught me that never to make assumptions about what other people are thinking in certain situations. And it also made me think a little bit about those reasons why people were there, and what their views of that might be. And it's interesting, he came out for later down once his English had sort of settled down a bit. He did very well, and it was a happy, thriving student, and that was lovely to see that journey as well. But yeah, it was. That's when you begin to start thinking a little bit more, when you have those sorts of experiences, a little bit more about, oh, okay, this is different from what I experienced, so therefore maybe start looking at a little bit about some of those aspects of it.
Thank you for sharing that story. I can connect with that young student. And in our work, I would say in my my one-to-one coaching, a lot of ex-boarders, the seen and heard, obviously we see thousands a year come for support, and podcasts and things like that. I would say that there's no ranking table of trauma or upset, but amongst the most wounded by boarding were the ones that came from overseas, because of the loss of food, culture, language, climate, parents, just an entire way of being. I mean, many of the ones who came over from Africa, they lost the red soil of Africa, they lost the food, they lost the connections, and the next thing they know, they're in a very austere sort of grey uniform, freezing cold, expected to play rugby in December. And it's just like, the culture shock is too great. But you also touched on something there which is very, very important, which is the expectations that I think are pretty universal amongst people who go to, boarding and independent schools. Not all, state boarding is a bit different, but there is certainly a feeling and a societal belief that you are extremely privileged to be there, and therefore you need to make a go of it. You need to keep your head down, make a go of it, and really don't speak out too much because you're very lucky to be there. Any thoughts, feelings coming up around what I've shared there?
Yeah, I think and anything where there might be an additional pressure, that sort of external pressure, can always cause problems, can't it? And even in any school, the where there's that perception, and it could be someone moving. You get lots of families moving into catchment areas for state day schools, don't you? And that could add a pressure. Yeah, and or whether it's paying independent school fees, whatever it is. And I think it's incumbent upon us as parents, and I speak as a parent now, to try and do what you can not to give those subtle sort of indicators that that might cause that extra additional anxiety. And I suspect too many parents who pay fees might end up sort of maybe not unthinkingly, but maybe there's a sort of oh well, I'm paying my fees for this or paying my fee, and actually it's probably always healthier to try and, as a parent, not make comments like that, isn't it? That sort of unintentionally might put a little bit of additional pressure on, because as you say, there might be the unintended consequences of that are that young people don't think that they can admit either their own failure or admit that something's wrong. And I think one of the big changes I saw over my 25 years in boarding was the rise of the pupil voice and how important that was. And so to try and support that by having everyone around the child supporting the fact that that they can either show their own vulnerabilities or if they need to say that something that is wrong, I think is important.
Yeah, thank you, David. I appreciate that. We'll talk a lot today about the schools and things like that, but what is so important is the parent side of things. Because ultimately parents have got their reasons for choosing whatever school it is or moving to catchment areas or whatever, and the real formative years, those 0 to 7 years, are usually spent outside of. Even I boarded from 7 onwards, but the first 7 years were, I'd already laid down a blueprint which I then took into boarding school, which was then sort of doubled down on, if you like, from an attachment perspective and things like that. So it is important to bring the parental conversation in. I think that when I've heard from ex-boarders who've come from overseas, there was the missionary, mercantile and military sector, obviously sort of conducting business on behalf of the empire all over the world, and children were sent back to board often for stability, for education, and to keep their culture, if you like, rather than to become part of the local culture wherever the parents were. And then there was the aspirational parents, if you like. So we're seeing a lot of that now. So young people coming over from particularly China, Hong Kong, Russia, other areas of the world. You'll know better than me the sort of main countries at the moment. But that I've heard a little bit. It's like off you go, sort of don't come back without a first from Oxbridge. And there is a real familial pressure to kind of get all the way through. The challenge with that, of course, is come sort of career 20s, 30s, middle age, etc. That pressure comes out. So the question really over to you is there a recognition of that within the boarding system, if you like, the industry, that young people coming in, whether it's from overseas or here, are bringing something into the school, are carrying something in? It could be expectations, it could be difficult stuff at home, etc. And kind of, what have you seen the schools start to do better to understand that and support young people?
Yeah, I think they're very much, in international, UK, whatever age. I think there's a real emphasis now on trying to work together with families to see it as that sort of everyone around the child, a very pupil-centred approach, and that includes in schools that I've worked in, looking at parental education quite seriously. Actually trying to highlight some of the things that well-meaning parents who may be, are just ambitious for their children and think they're doing the right thing, but maybe don't have the expertise, might do unintentionally that can be harmful. So actually acknowledging, the some of those pressures and talking about it and trying to help parents navigate that world in a way that isn't harmful. Because actually, if you put too much pressure on a young person, then they end up, having significant anxiety or something like that. As a result of that, they aren't going to actually achieve what the goal was, which was, an Oxbridge education or whatever they might be looking for. So actually, to engage with parents in that way, and maybe to be a bit firmer in some of those discussions as well. That was something that we would talk about in schools I've worked in, where you actually have to say, we need to now communicate with parents about the fact that some of the things they're saying to their children are not helping and are at odds with what we're saying. So I think absolutely an acknowledgement. Wherever you've got language issues, that can be more difficult, of course. So and cultural sort of mismatches as well. But I think schools have been working and are on that journey and are very mindful of some of that landscape that comes with children coming into their schools.
Yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, I mean, let's, I think there's two ways to sort of, my head's going. That one of them is, if you like, boarding numbers, the high numbers of schools that are, and I don't say this in a way to imply, anything wrong necessarily, but I have some fear and concerns about the number of schools that I would say are fishing overseas to bring in boarders. So I know a number of schools they're struggling to get boarders in from, let's say, the British, the domestic market, particularly middle class, British nationals, and they are very actively, with advertising, using agencies, etc., kind of fishing overseas for more overseas pupils. I have a fear about the impact on young people of bringing them away from home so far across the world into different cultures and things like that. But you have you work within the system. You see a different, you see a lot of things I don't see. So could you speak a little bit to, franchising schools out to other countries is one thing, but this is more about boarding schools actively recruiting pupils from overseas to so their business model is, they've got enough customers, if you like, for the business model. So what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I think schools have a much greater awareness of supporting people when they do come long distances to board. I think families see it as a real opportunity to take advantage of, what is still a real gold standard in education. So I think families are still very interested in a UK education. Of course, this is a globally. It's not just UK schools doing this. Schools from around the world market globally for that. I think also one of the key advantages that you get in boarding houses. When I think back to some of the groups that I've worked with, a year 10 group in a given boarding house, who are a very diverse, interesting group, and actually the advantage of going into a global world from having a global boarding education can be something that's really appealing. And we also have a much much greater possibility of connection with home now, with technology, Zoom calls or video calls, and being able to keep in touch with home and with culture. So I think the landscape, I would say, with schools being very aware of it, being much more mindful about good induction, being really mindful about making sure there's opportunities to connect with home. And maybe some of the things that might have come into play 20 or 30 years ago, where it was sort of like much more difficult, you might not have felt there was any possibility of any connection with home. Now I think that does look very different. So people are able to sort of to maintain those connections. We're also seeing other structural changes within the sector. So much more sort of short-term boarding. So people coming to board for a term or for a year, and then go back. So we've got, or indeed people coming to one country, maybe going back to their home country for a year and then going somewhere else. So that's very different, I think, to how overseas boarding maybe looked 20 years ago.
Yeah, thank you for your perspective on that. I think what you've done there is it neatly sort of opened up quite a big topic, which is important for us to talk about, the change, in boarding. So people who work in the system, many people I know who work in the system who knew what it was like, before, will say, and I've heard those exact words, is, all that stuff you're talking about, all the people that come to you were within a system that was very different. It was, it's a different world now, and it's sort of, everything's better now. They probably wouldn't say that much because nothing's perfect, right? But a lot has changed. So you had 20 odd years in boarding schools. You also, as the head of the governing body for the sort of industry, its history as well. So perhaps I'd love to hear from you. What are the big things that have changed? And, in a real sort of transparency, a real sort of honesty, what is still work in progress? What is not where you want it to be? So maybe just breaking that into two parts. What's changed and what still needs work?
Yeah, and I'd never say this with any intention to diminish those experiences that happened in the past. But I think it's, as you say, we must acknowledge that. But it is different. It looks different from me thinking about what it was like entering the sector. I think actually the key really has come through. It is a cultural change, but it has come as a result of legislation and compliance issues. So you look back on the Children's Act of, I think it was 1989, as being an absolutely key seminal bit of legislation there, and that has led on and influenced other key documents that schools work with, that keeping children safe in education. I think that came in about 2015. The national minimum standards for boarding, which were first written in, I think, 2002, and have most recently been updated in 2022. And therefore, safeguarding and that concept of safeguarding, which I don't think I would have even known really what the word meant when I entered the sector, in terms of, it just wasn't in the narrative around what schools were training you to do. Now is so central to the culture of saying, okay, that is our number one priority. So safeguarding being central. And as part of that, the contextual safeguarding of making sure that pupil voice is very strong is also, I think, absolutely critical, and being very much centred on that pupil experience. These sorts of phrases that you hear all the time, the pupil being at the centre of it, and I think that culture has changed significantly. I think you've also got other changes like now very much that decision to go into boarding is a pupil decision. When I used to go around and talk to boarders, talk to them about it. So how come you're here? You just hear all the time, I just love it here. I really wanted to come to this school, really wanted to be a boarder. So that element of choice and keeping the pupil voice at the centre, I think, is important. And flexibility as well. That's been a big shift in the system, where I think schools historically weren't always particularly flexible to saying, well, you can board 3 nights a week if that's what works for you, or you can board this term but not that term. Whatever it is that works, that flexibility, I think, has been a big change. And there is also a reality, which is that when you look at the average fee over the course of the last 20 years, that's gone up significantly, not just due to VAT on fees, but it has gone up, which means facilities are better. There's much more. You go into schools now, and sort of the big dormitories are virtually non-existent now. Much more sort of smaller, nurturing environments in that respect. So I think there have been some big changes, which I hope people see as being a positive. And I think in terms of work in progress, the key danger is complacency, isn't it? And the key danger is that you can't sit there and say, well, everything is fine now. Whatever sector in education you're in, but particularly I think in boarding, for us to keep making sure that we're keeping those things, a safeguarding and pupil-centred, pupil voiced experience front and centre of what we do, I think is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, so what I'm hearing very much is that safeguarding and reform, legislative reform has placed, focus, in the right places, the pupil's voice, and facilities. Yeah, flexibility and levels of communication. Yeah, so really hearing those changes. I wouldn't be doing my job, if you like, if I didn't provide a kind of a devil's advocate to kind of, on a couple of those things, particularly because of the work I do, emotional health. We're very networked in with hundreds of therapists, psychologists, etc. So just on a couple of those points, one of the ones that I personally find a bit challenging is the technology bit. I absolutely accept that it is better. So when I was at school, there was one payphone. It was, like a prison movie. There's one payphone. You all lined up. You had a couple of minutes in front of everybody else in the queue with a phone card to phone home. So you had to keep it at that level. Letters were read before they were sent to parents, and screened, etc. And it was often the letters that came from home would have been opened, etc. And that was late 80s, early 90s. So it wasn't like the 50s or something. So that clearly, having a device where you can contact your family and speak to them honestly when you need to is clearly a lot better than that. But anyone in mental health would say it's not the same as having your family there. So do you have a feeling on that? Do you have a thought on that?
I mean, yeah, what you said. I mean, having a video call is not the same experience as sitting next to someone in person. But it is, as I said, it is better than the experience that you've described. So I think we agree on where that is.
Mm.
I know that you would, mobile phone policies in schools notwithstanding, you'd quite regularly sort of see, I'm just going to text my mum about this. Is that okay? Can I just? Of course it is. Just so that level of communication, that is a difference. I think we probably agree
Mm.
that's not quite the
Yeah.
same, but it is an improvement.
Improvement. Yeah, I hear that. And I'm very much not a black and white person. I believe, there is a middle road, which is there is a direction of travel towards all children being seen and heard and safe and loved. And so anything along that journey, I'm up for. The other one, I think that again, I find that a challenge around, because I know so much about the need for appropriate physical touch in child development, that one thing safeguarding has come in. I know a lot of people who work in boarding schools, and the safeguarding is very rigorous. Yeah, particularly around what you can and can't. You absolutely can't be alone with pupils. You can't touch them in any way, shape, or form. And the, that is much better than the environments that I was at school and many others where some really questionable people were employed in the schools without proper training credentials, without safeguarding systems, and we know awful things happened. So I welcome the move. The challenge is with it is it's gone so far that touch starvation and not being able to hug someone who is homesick, who is crying or has hurt themselves, etc. That is a daily challenge for people who work in boarding, who might be parents themselves, who are just human beings who see a child hurt or in trouble, and they want to naturally do what we're supposed to do because we're wired up that way. What's your take on that difficult balance between like getting safeguarding really rigorous, which it has to be, and human beings touch, the importance of that?
Yeah, I think that comes down to the culture in the school, and that comes from their training and the leadership within the school to make sure that people understand exactly what you've described there, and some of the challenges, some of the situations where you might do a perfectly natural human thing, and I think it all comes down for me to school culture, and that in itself has been, again, is you asked about how we could still get better. Well, it's only relatively recently that you saw or we saw designated safeguarding leads as being sort of mandated in every school, and the training around that, whether that's sort of a specific job or whether that's done on the side of people's other jobs. And I think that can be something where we could continue to work, because I think the quality of the interactions that you can have alongside a really robust safeguarding culture or in schools, that stems from that leadership within schools, both of the heads but also the DSLs in school, that can really enable healthy human behaviour without the risk of undermining the safeguarding. So it comes down to that, and we've got potentially things will develop in that area, from government, how they sort of mandate different roles, how they mandate the training around that. But we would only support that to try and make sure that they can lead the culture in the right way in schools.
Yeah, thank you, David. So important. It's we've got certainly most of the independent inquiry into child sex abuse recommendations, the ICSA recommendations coming down the line. The government looking to have more than half of them in train by the second half of the year. There's lots of them. There's a number of them buried in the police and crime bill that's going through, things like that. So, things like mandatory reporting for child sexual abuse, things like that. There definitely, many hardliners would say they don't go far enough, and I would agree with a number of them. However, I can also see progress. I can also see that is a lot better than not protecting children. And when you mention the Children's Act, I always find it very upsetting that the independent sector maintained corporal punishment for 10 years after the ban. I find that difficult. I find that really difficult because they just held on to, spare the rod, spoil the child for 10 years longer than everyone else. So it was. I find that one tricky. But I know that the legislation is going the right way, and that the schools are trying to make sure that happens. So yeah, with the direction we're going with the conversation, I really appreciate you sort of being honest about some of these tricky things. Another thing that comes up quite a lot is that boarding provides stability and a safe environment for young people where home might not be, whether it be unsafe or whether actually there's a lot going on at home, death, divorce, changes, etc. Or maybe parents are moving around a lot for work and so they don't feel like they should drag the kids around with them. They want to give them a stable place to be. What's your view on that? That boarding offers a service, if you like, for giving children more stability and connection if things at home are, let's say, fluid or difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't. I'd say there's many reasons why boarding can be a positive move for families. I think that's one that you do here, that there is that sort of stable sort of stability, if you like, and people who might, as you say, their parents might be posted overseas, maybe from a military background. That can be a real positive, and that's something I hear from boarders. They describe a sort of moving from place to place, and actually they're one place that they feel most at home can be their school. So I think where that can be the case. I mean, obviously, if they're sitting there, these boarders saying, I find that really that's something really positive in my life, and that's a good thing. I don't think that's the primary reason why lots of people choose to board. I don't think there's, if we've got 65,000 UK boarders, I don't think there's 65,000 people who are doing it simply for that stability. But I think it can be a positive for some young people, and that sort of sense of feeling like this is a place that they can relax and be themselves, and that sort of the way the house systems can work, where you've got that consistency. I think that can be a real positive, and that's one of the national minimum standards for boarding, is you have consistency of staffing within boarding houses, which I think again is a positive thing.
Thank you, David. Yeah, thanks. So what if it's not stability, and it can be in some cases, but you said that's not the reason why most board. What's your belief behind what is attracting the majority of people to board? Because I guess it's, we're going back to my sort of business world marketing hat. The young person isn't the customer, if you like. They're the sort of consumer, and the customer is the parent. So, and school is the business, the provider. So, what if the customers are the parents? What is still attracting a large number of parents to choose to board their children? What are those parents feeling they're getting from making that choice?
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is that I don't think that is actually how many families see it now. I think my experience, and again, personal experience of talking to boarders, is when you ask them, about that sort of space, about how they came to be, they often say, "No, I was the one who was choosing this." Now, I'm not saying that's everyone, but that was what I heard from boarders was I went out. So I think actually the the parents are often saying, "Yeah, here are some options for school. Which ones do you want?" And then when you talk to boarders about why they love it, because often that is, I'm not saying that every single boarder in the country is having the best experience, but most of the boarders I would talk to were really positive. And they would talk about lots of different things. They would talk about being able to spend more time with their friends and really enjoying those aspects. They'd talk about the fact that they could have access to the facilities for longer. They enjoyed the fact that they would, able to go and play football at 9 o'clock or go use the climbing wall at 7 o'clock or whatever those sorts of things were. Some people will talk about just really wanting to go to that school for various reasons. Maybe they specialised in something and they wouldn't be able to access that otherwise. There would be people who talk about things as simple as the commute and not, the fact that they could, they didn't need to travel long distances every day in traffic. Some people talked about the diversity of the population. They would talk about sort of how wonderful it was to meet lots of different people from different backgrounds. So there's a lot of different reasons. I mean, I don't think you can sort of distill it down into one or two. But it certainly felt, even though there's a reality, obviously, that who is paying the fees, that's the parent. But it was unusual, I think, in certainly in recent years that I've been working in boarding, for pupils to say this wasn't, I wasn't front and centre of this decision making.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I appreciate your perspective on that. I think that sounds like there has been a significant change, in that if you're not going to, see so many people of my generation and earlier were sent away, so there was a decision made, and because of familial traditions, because of whatever it was, that's just what we did round here. So off they went, and we've had absolute shockers, people being sedated on planes to get in Africa to get them to school, and things like that, which I think we can all agree are just absolutely unconscionable. But the one thing that I have heard from a couple of psychologists who inputted into our report around choosing boarding and kind of the factors around it is boarding school right for my child, is this idea that a young person can't fully appreciate the nuances of what boarding will be like and what will happen to them and their development and all the other aspects around it, positive and detrimental, because all things we know of both sides. They're just not in a position to be able to understand that until really 14 plus, and it's the same. Like 14 plus is the age for informed consent. Even like to do a questionnaire with a child. At 14 plus they can make their own decision as to whether they do the questionnaire. Before that, you need parental permission. So do you feel that people choosing to board younger than 14, the choice is really something that they can fully understand the implications of?
Well, I mean, clearly there is. I mean, I don't think I would have sort of clear cut-off ages, because I suspect different people mature at different rates and are better able to. And there's obviously if you talk to very young people, then clearly they wouldn't understand that. I don't think that's any reason not to include them in the decision making. I think actually to have those conversations, and probably parents naturally, whatever it is, whether it's about education or anything, will make more decisions for children, the younger they are, won't they? So I think that's for parents to factor in, is that maturity and what that does look like. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. I think we appreciate time is short, but there's a couple of things I would love to just still explore a little bit. There's been a lot in the press, isn't there, around independent schooling more generally. Fees, there's VAT, there's charitable status, there's all sorts of stuff that's sort of moving around. From your perspective, how is the health of your sector, and are these newspaper reports sort of very recently to this recording, the sort of death knell has been sounding for cathedral schools because of a couple of closure or something, etc. What this is you're the head of your body, if you like. What's your take on where boarding and independent schools are heading?
Yeah, I mean, there's very specific to the UK with the change of adding VAT to fees. Yeah, I mean, it's had an impact. There's no surprise there. If you make anything more expensive, fewer people are going to choose it. I think it's just a resizing, which is currently playing out in the sector, and I think we will see where that lands. I mean, I wouldn't want to particularly speculate. I don't think any part of the sector will totally close. You mentioned cathedral schools there. Yes, you might see in the news sort of people responding to one or two changes, but I don't think we will see sort of an absolute clash or collapse, sorry, of any particular sort of subsection of the sector. Nor is there no effect whatsoever. So I think it's been certainly a challenging time whilst we're seeing that playing out, and of course there's a falling demographic that's hitting schools as well. So there's going to be if you've got fewer people of a certain age, you're gonna need fewer schools. So that is playing out, and wherever you have that, that can as people are trying to make sure that their school isn't the one that closes. I think you see people working hard to make sure that what they're offering is as good as it can be. So actually, we're seeing lots of schools working very hard to make sure that the offer that they have for the families and the young people is as good as it can be as well.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I mean, I hear you on that. There's a bit of consolidation in the market, if you like. With our view, obviously, seen in her schools, is that the ones who put pupil wellbeing, welfare, staff wellbeing and welfare at the top of the agenda, not buzzwords, not stuff for the prospectus, but they actually, they throw their hearts and souls into it to make a really trauma-informed, healthy school, are going to be the ones that make it. And the ones that are still trying to fight it out on sort of sports facilities, academic results, over time are going to drop away, because we now know that EQ, emotional intelligence, is far more of a determinant for a successful life than IQ, than just exam results or whatever. What's your take on kind of wellbeing and welfare as the core, the heart of where schools need to go, or versus it being a bit of a buzzword that sort of tick a box?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots to say on this, isn't there? I mean, the rise of AI is part of this as well, in that schools are really scratching their heads over what a good education that sets people up for a successful life is going to look like. But I think there's a fairly universal acknowledgement, as you say, EQ is increasingly important. I think there's also an acknowledgement that people, in order to succeed at anything, whatever that looks like, need to be feeling well in themselves. So therefore, actually, that side of the school's work supports the academic side or the sporting side or whatever it is as well. So I think lots of schools are going beyond any sort of sense of this is just a buzzword. They're really trying to live. They're doing their best to really try and live that as well. So I am 100% behind that move towards really looking after. In fact, my previous, when I was working in school, my job title was deputy head pastoral and wellbeing. So that was very much front and center of what we were trying to do. We were sort of aligned as much as we could with the government's sort of 5 ways to wellbeing and some of those things where we looked at making sure that people could make great connections, which again is something that boarding can do really well. People can feel very connected and feel like they do belong in these schools, and that can be very positive for wellbeing. I think as with anything, you've got people trying to make decisions with good intentions, but how you promote well-being in wherever you are, whether it's work or schools, there's lots of different people creating lots of noise in that sector. So trying to make good decisions on that, I think, can be we're not always going to get every decision right. Do you allocate it to more staffing? Do you allocate it to putting sort of physical rooms, well-being hubs, quiet spaces around schools? How do you go about doing that? How much do you sort of try and sort of push people to achieve in various ways, whilst trying to support people and making sure that that you're not putting too much pressure on? But that's an age-old problem, isn't it? It's not a problem for schools. It's a problem for society. It's a problem for parents. You sort of sit there. You'll know this yourself. How much do you try and push your own children, out of their comfort zones, and how much do you ease off? I mean, it's very difficult, isn't it?
Oh, it's hugely, David. Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's I guess what I hear a lot from the sector is people trying to do their best with it, but burnout is the big challenge. Young people and teachers, in the race to kind of provide an amazing education, sport, music, art, well-being, welfare. It's a very long school day. It's a long working week, and I think there is a bit of a risk of sort of trying to be all things to all people in a competition to stay alive as a business, stay alive as a school. I appreciate time is very short now. In fact, we've gone over, and I apologise. Are you okay? Just a few minutes for us to bring it to a close.
Yeah, just a couple of minutes. I'm conscious I need to eat.
Yeah, very important. No, very important, David. You've given more than enough time. Have you got my concept of this is, in any school, this is not boarding schools, but less is more. Yeah, time for space, time for unstructured play, time for human beings, including teachers. And a lot of teachers in my life in independent schools, and they do not get any breaks, really. They're full on, often 12, 14 hours a day. So, what would you say out there and to member schools and things about this balance, for human beings to have some downtime?
It's really important, isn't it? And actually, I mean, it was something I remember going back to where we started from. Actually, maybe this is a nice way to tie it all together. I remember thinking when I joined that first boarding school how lovely it was just to be able to hang out for a bit, because we weren't constrained by you're starting at 8:30 and you're finishing at 3:30 and trying to pack everything in there. That was actually quite nice to be able to have a bit of space. Now, again, we could probably talk for another hour about the workload and the how busy staff are. I was certainly always a member of staff who thrived off that. I loved the fact that there was plenty of stuff going on, but I also enjoyed the fact that there was a bit more space in that school where we could have a little bit of a break in the middle of the day, and then come back and do maybe an extra. If I was doing a physics revision class for an exam, we could do that at 7 o'clock at night, because actually we're all here, and that had allowed us to have that sort of slightly different cadence of the day. So yeah, I mean, it's super important, isn't it? And there's also the fact, I again, very personal to me. I'm not saying everyone feels this, but because we get good holidays in schools, I always had that guilt of, well, I've got to earn that holiday because I've got to work quite hard in term time so that I can personally feel that I could earn that holiday, which again is, that was very personal to me, and maybe others don't feel that, but it's a very complex issue, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say, and there's lots of different factors, and it will play out very differently to different people.
Thank you for your thoughts on that. So we've come to the end. We've gone over. Would like to acknowledge that from what I've seen at this end, as far as your engagement with me and some of the programs you got, things like the Fitness to Board program, where you're actually asking the question, should people be here boarding or not in schools, and teaching, and helping schools to understand whether people are suited for it or not. I think even that, that's a step forward for me. You've invited us to speak at a Wellbeing and Welfare conference. The fact you even have one, really, makes me feel good about that. And I've seen your training program, and there's a lot of stuff around safeguarding and wellbeing and welfare. So I just want to acknowledge, very importantly, that I can see that is something you're actively working on. I can see it's an improvement from the past. And thank you for your engagement on it. Now, there is a big topic which we can't do today, but I would love to have a conversation another day around, some of the historical stuff, because, it's good that things are moving in the right direction, but it hasn't always been that way. And I believe we need a sort of truth and reconciliation, so that those who were wounded in the past by abuse and things that happened in boarding schools and other institutions can be heard and recognised. Would you be willing to come on, have another conversation, and we can explore that another time?
Yeah, I mean, we as you know, I'm very grateful to you for acknowledging that we're trying to support the sector, and part of that is to make sure that the sector is as open as we can be to supporting everyone, whether that's current pupils or people who've been through the system, and parents and staff. We've touched on all of those, haven't we? So look, I'm very happy to continue to engage with you on this, and we exist to support excellence in boarding. So whatever we can do that helps with that mission to try and support our member schools and staff in the schools, and crucially, as I kept coming back to, the young people at the centre of our schools. Anything we can do that supports them, we're happy to.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for your time today, David. Thanks for your energy. And thank you very much for listening. It's been the Seen and Heard podcast. Been with David Walker of the BSA. And yeah, I look forward to hopefully a future conversation with you, David, where we can unpack that, because it's a topic in itself, and other things, keeping that relationship and that dialogue going. So thank you, David, for today. We'll let you go. And thank you so much for listening, and hope to see you on the next episode. Bye for now.
Thanks very much, Chris. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.